for some additional folks to join in, and then we'll get started. Thanks.
Good morning, Fred. This is Tom Long with Turn.
Good morning.
Morning. I didn't see any email sharing the slides in advance. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe we didn't get those out. Joe, can we make the slides available following the workshop?
Yes, we can. Yep, that's fine.
I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Joe. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's the presentation that is showing now. I think that's 16 pages. And then we're also going to be going over the supplemental work papers, spreadsheets that we have already provided all the parties.
Okay, good. If there's any chance you can send the presentation in real time, sometimes it helps to be able to navigate the slides independently of what's being put up on the screen.
I think we could probably do that. Joe, do you think you have access to the service list we're using for the community? Is that something you all can do since we have a moment before we start here?
I would, in fairness of my technical capabilities, I'd have to download the most recent copy of the service list, and then I'd need to put that into email format to send it out, and that's going to take me at least 10 minutes.
Oh, then, I mean, if you want to send me the presentation, I can send it out. I don't remember if you got me those slides.
I think you were on the email I sent Alicia last night.
Okay.
But I mean, I can do it again.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, I see you sent us some work papers. Oh yeah, okay, PowerPoint. I apologize.
Yeah.
Very well.
But also, I mean, to be fair, we send the PowerPoint to SPD because it's easier for them to show the PowerPoint and the presentation.
Right.
When we send a copy to all participants, we convert it to PDF.
Oh, very well. Right. That's fair. We would have to convert it to a PDF. Let's see here.
Tom, if you want, we can, we have a couple of minutes waiting for the commissioner. We can go through the slides real quickly, and so you can see what they are. It's medium pressure info, high pressure info, storage info that sort of repeats. And so, Brevin, you want to just go through the slides real quick, and so Tom can see what we'll be doing. So there's the agenda.
Joe, I believe the commissioner has joined. I saw.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Tom. So let's just go back to the front slide, and we'll let the workshop begin. Thank you.
Okay. Let me get back to the. Thank you, everyone. We were just discussing getting a PDF copy of the presentation out to participants this morning, which I will work on as soon as my little portion of the meeting is over, and I will get that out to the service list within a few moments. So thank you, Tom, for requesting that. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Fred Haynes. I'm a senior utilities engineer with the Safety Policy Division at the Commission, and I am the lead analyst on the Sempra ramp evaluation. And joining us this morning is the assigned commissioner, Commissioner Darcy Houck. And she's asked to say a few introductory remarks before we get started. So Commissioner Houck, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred. I just want to thank Fred and Ben and staff for all of their work putting this workshop together. This is the first ramp proceeding that I have been assigned, and with all of the impacts we're seeing from climate change, especially the devastating fires, This is a very important proceeding and I want to make sure I'm as informed as possible. So I'm here to listen and learn about how SoCalGas has assessed risks for their higher cost mitigations and learn more about their risk spend efficiency calculations. And again, I'm here to listen and learn, and I'm interested to see the presentation. So thank you. And with that, I will turn it back over to Fred.
Thank you, Commissioner Hauk. I just would like to start out by mentioning that we have a very tight agenda program for this morning, where we're really wanting to focus on the 3 topics laid out. We also have a need to respect the time schedules of all the participants. So we will be ending the workshop promptly at 12 noon. I'll just note there is time at the end of the agenda for addressing possible future needs, loose strings, wrap up and next steps portion. So let's please carefully watch our time and follow through the agenda at the scheduled time so that we can cover all the planned information. With that, I would like to turn things over to Joe McCauley of Sempra to begin the day's agenda.
Thank you, Fred. Appreciate it, and thank you for Commissioner for joining us today. Should be definitely an eventful next 3 hours. Wanted to go over, if you will, or I should say, Fred sent out a request of the stakeholders, the parties, their thoughts for topics for today's workshop. He sent that request out a while back, before we had the July 12th workshop where we overviewed the supplemental work papers, and then he sent out a request subsequent to that if there were any changes. I've coordinated with Fred on those requests. We put together the agenda, and we think we will be addressing certainly most of the questions that have been asked. To the extent we do not proactively address them, there will be question and answer periods within the presentation. So we look forward to those discussions. If we go to the next slide, please. The agenda, as Fred said, it is tight. What this shows, you'll see on the agenda some lightly colored topics, and then even one that's crossed out. In reviewing the agenda, reviewing the allocated time, we may have been a bit optimistic, if you will, in the amount of time that we will have. And then also, I do want to remind folks that are not speaking to please put their microphone on mute to hold down the background noise. And so we were planning on going over the RC calculations for 2 mitigations within each of these chapters, medium, high, and storage pressures. There may not be time. We're thinking there just may not be time to go over the RC quant analysis for 2. And so we're definitely planning on doing it for 1. And I've modified the agenda accordingly. Again, that's what that represents. The main focus of the workshop is, as the Commissioner mentioned, Fred mentioned, overview aspects of SoCalGas's asset-based risks, i.e. the medium pressure incident, high pressure incident, and the storage incident risks. We'll be using the supplemental work papers for each of these risks to overview the data sources, and the equations used to calculate the core, the LOR, and the risk scores at the risk level, and then also to overview how the RC values were calculated for at least 1 mitigation within each of these risks. As I said, those are the same work papers that each of the parties have been previously provided, and we overviewed during the July 12th workshop. After the quant review, we'll then discuss how the program level forecasts were developed, and the integrity management program team will discuss when and how SoCalGas identifies and prioritizes projects to utilize the requested and authorized funds that are at the program level. We'll have a Q&A after the quant overview at the risk level. We'll have a Q&A after the quant at the mitigation level. And we'll have a Q&A after the discussion on the integrity management programs within those risks. The planned cadence is medium pressure, high pressure, and storage. And before we get started, just wanted to remind everyone that the ramp proceeding is not a request for funds. And as mentioned on SPD's website, the ramp proceeding is the second of a two-step procedure. The first being the safety model assessment proceeding that the commission adopted to incorporate risk-based decision framework into the evaluation of
At 10 a.m.
we need to mute microphones, please. So the commission adopted the SMAP proceeding to incorporate a risk-based decision framework to evaluate the safety and reliability improvements within the large utilities general rate cases. And that is where we request the funds. RAMP applications provide an opportunity for the commission to verify that each utility has appropriately used the risk-based decision framework as adopted in the SMAP. So in summary, within the RAMP, the utilities describe their plans to identify, to assess, and to mitigate the risks. So that's the agenda, and that's, if you will, the cadence and thoughts of the workshop. Would anyone like to offer any thoughts before we get going on to the next slide? If not, next slide, please. Initially, the initial thought for the workshop was high cost mitigations. And then after some discussions, we said, all right, let's focus on the medium, high, and storage incidents. And what I did to sort of connect those two together, within the RAMP report, we identified mitigations and we prioritized them by RC value. I took that table and I sorted it by dollar. So where it has total cost, these are the dollars that are within the RAMP report associated in the table. I think it's Appendix C1, where we sort the mitigations by RC value. And I sorted them for the SoCal Gas chapters, high to low, by cost. And so this is the top 20. The idea is on this slide not to go over all of them, but to inform everyone that yes, the high cost mitigations within the SoCal Gas RAMP report are primarily associated with the medium pressure, high pressure, and storage. The integrity management programs have a significant role within those top 20 high costs. These numbers from the high of 657 million to 61 million, and again for the top 20, these numbers represent the sum of 3 years of dollars. And so when they calculate the RC values, it's the sum of 3 years for capital and O&M. And so that's what these dollars represent. It's not for any one particular year. These dollars are the sum of 3 years. And again, this is just sort of for additional background. Next slide. As I mentioned up front, the cadence is going to be medium pressure, high pressure, and then storage. And so to initiate the discussion on medium pressure, next page. Incident related to medium pressure gas system, excluding dig-ins. The risk description, the risk of damage caused by a medium pressure system, which is defined as lower than 60 PSI or PSIG, failure event, which results in serious consequences such as injury, fatalities, or outages, and includes consequences beyond the customer meter. Core lore and risk score is shown there, and Jeff will be overviewing how those numbers were calculated. And on a high level within this risk, there were 32 existing activities, 19, again, whenever we use the word controls and mitigations, just a reminder, we use controls, we give an activity a control ID if it was an activity that was active as of December of last year. We give an activity a mitigation ID if it's planned to begin after December of last year. And so within the medium pressure risk chapter, we have a total of 32 existing, we had activities. 19 of them are, I refer to it as holistically pertaining to the medium pressure system. We have 4 of them that are specific to the distribution integrity management program. We have 1 that is specific to the control center modernization. And then we have 8 that pertain to the customer service fields. There are no planned new mitigations within the medium pressure, SoCal Gas's medium pressure risk chapter. And of those 32 activities, 9 of them which we will show on the next page, are in fact in the top 20. The next slide. And this is them. You'll remember that on the previous slide when we had them sorted, it had a singular number. When we prepare the RSCs this year, we use the forecast values to calculate the RSC. Last ramp, we used the range of numbers, and so we had a high and a low RSC. This year we had one RSC, and by having one RSC, that meant we used the forecast numbers. Within the ramp report itself, we identify a range of numbers. And so this table are numbers from the ramp report. Everything that we're showing you today on the slides is all information that was contained in the ramp report and or provided in the spreadsheets that we provided you. So the very first one is highlighted. Highlighted means that's the mitigation we anticipate going over to show you the RSC values. These, again, this is just a little bit of background to show that these are the high cost mitigations within the SoCalGas medium pressure chapter. I think I sorted these high to low based on cumulative cost. Again, some of them have only capital, some of them have both, some of them have only O&M, and some of them also have both capital and O&M. Again, this is background information. Again, the focus will now be going over how we calculate the quants for the risk itself. And then we'll be going over how we calculate the quants specific to the integrity management program, and then a discussion on the integrity management program and how that interacts with the ramp, the dollars in the ramp program itself. Are there any, I don't feel that I'm going quickly, but then I put together the slides. Are there any questions for me before Jeff starts his quant on the, for the risk level quant? If not, this is where we transition from Brevin having control of the slides to Jeff having control of the slides.
So good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. All right, cool. My share content button just came up. Let me get my content sharing.
Sorry, Jeff, your sound is very low.
All right. Let me see what I can do here. Can everybody hear me now? Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So it's my microphone. All right. If that happens, just let me know. Thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen. What I should be sharing is the work paper for medium pressure incident. All right, turn off.
Perhaps you could expand that, zoom that out to
Sure.
make it a little bigger on the screen.
Definitely. All right. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I'll walk through the workbook. I'll walk through the workbook itself and kind of talk through some of the stuff. So I'll be moving the workbook around and I appreciate the ability to share. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Bunting. I am a project manager within the Enterprise Risk Management Department at SoCalGas. And today we are going to walk you through the work paper. I know there was another workshop that kind of did something similar, but we're going to walk you through the asset-based work paper, kind of just show you how it works, where the numbers are coming from, and how they all kind of roll up into the risk score. So first I'll cover kind of the work paper. So obviously this is what we called the supplemental work papers, which included 2 additional tabs from the first work papers that we had submitted, and it gave you a little bit more in-depth to how we calculated risk score, and that's essentially the sheet that I'm displaying now is the risk scoring, and we'll walk through that. So the purpose of these workbooks is to give you flexibility to change certain parameters of the MAVF and the ranges and the weights and anything else you can think of, and produce, RSCs based on those changes. And so this is an all live workbook that we provided. And so if I change things, you'll be able to see things change as well. Okay. So I'm going to just get right into it. So essentially, and we'll start with the risk scoring work paper as Joe mentioned. And our whole goal here is to give you an understanding of how we did this. And we want you to know that. So if you have questions, please do ask when I have finished going through this. So risk score, we can see the arrow pop up here, is obviously the lore times the core. And you can see that's what gives us our risk score. Now, how we get our core is the summation of the different attributes, the core attributes: safety, financial, reliability, stakeholder satisfaction. When you look at the lore, come over here, we see it's the summation of the two sub-event lores. So one of the things that we did to try and capture a greater understanding of the risk at the enterprise is we broke the risk down into sub-events. So that's what you're seeing here. So we defined, in the medium pressure side, we defined a high consequence event and we defined a low consequence event. Essentially what that means is your high consequence has a safety impact. One of the terms we'll be using is hazardous incident, which is essentially an incident that causes a rupture or explosion and has safety impacts. And a low consequence incident, which you can see from the core safety here, doesn't have any safety impacts. It's more about reliability impacts. So the two sub-events together create the overall risk score that we use to quantify the risk. Now I'll walk into how we actually do the overall. And so the overall risk score, sorry for some reason the screen seems to be chopping around a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't make anybody sick. But it's a weighted average against the lores essentially. So for the two sub-events, it's a weighted average between the core safety for each sub-event outside the lore. And you can see up here, as the formula kind of shows, that you have your lore for that sub-event times your core of that sub-event plus the lore of the second sub-event times the core, all divided by the sum of the lores. So you kind of get where we're going here. Sorry, I'm trying to get that. There we go. Thank you. So let's dive into, and I plan on going a little bit deeper dive into the medium pressure. All the workbooks, I'll just say up front, are structured the same. They all have this sort of sub-event, you know, and same mathematical process to get to the score. So I'm going to dive into this one. You know, if there's time, I'll do the other ones, but if not, it's the same, and I just want to state that. So let's talk about the high consequence safety and how do we get that. So if you scroll down on this workbook, you'll kind of see how we devise these expected values, if you will. And you can also see that in the formulas, we're using data, national, internal, and you know, academic data to produce a reasonable expected value we can see from a risk event, and then we run it through the MAVF, and that gives us our core value. And that's all done at the sub-event level. So when you look at your actual total core, it's just a summation of these four core attributes. But moving on, actually what I'll do first is I'll do lore, since that's the first part. So we look at our lore, we'll just come down here to the likelihood and our high consequence sub-event and our low consequence sub-event. And kind of stepping through this, you can basically just kind of walk down this and see what our thought process and how we develop these numbers. So for the medium pressure incident, for high consequence, we looked at national data. National data, in general, when we use national data, it's a bigger data set than our own, so it's very useful. But we also try to tailor it a little bit to ours, since our territory operates a little bit differently than national. So we do keep that in mind, and you'll see that as we walk through this. But looking at the high consequence, there's 26 hazardous incidents, which I described above. Over 10 years of data gives us a rate, 2.6. We looked at our after meter incident because, as Joe mentioned, this risk also includes beyond the meter. And using our own internal data, we were able to come up with a rate based on the incidents we've seen in the past. The lore then for the high consequence sub-event becomes the summation of the two likelihoods. For the low consequence, again, this is the 542. We use internal data. So we had a certain set of a number of years of data, and we looked at how many different incidents did we have on the medium pressure system that didn't result in a safety incident. And that numbers comes out to basically you're seeing the 542. And which becomes the 2.6, and then obviously the 542 that you'll see up here. Now, let's talk about core safety a little bit. Same sort of methodology here. We look at the sub-events first, we see what data is available, and then we kind of step through this process to get us an expected value. So again, we're starting nationally, and we say, all right, of the incidents we've seen, 6 of them were these hazardous, result in a fatality or injury. And I don't want to necessarily step through all of this just because you can read, but we made some, as I said, we make some adjustments where we can for the national data to get more closely accurate to how we are in SoCalGas. What does that mean? well, we have a lot more HCA miles than other utilities and nationally. Our rates are different. Some of the incidents we don't actually have. I'll give you an example. We don't have any compressor incidences in our past. And so we had to go nationally for that. But because we did that, we wanted to adjust, and it seemed reasonable to adjust to the California sort of operating climate. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here. We developed a factor based on population density, because in general, SoCalGas is more populated than other parts of the country. And we got this factor to help us factor in that we're operating with more people. And so you continue to step through. From the national rate, you can see the average fatalities per incident. And then to get our expected, it's that percentage of adjusted percentage of hazardous incidents or fatality or injury times our rate, gives us our expected value, our expected fatalities per incident for SoCalGas. And same thing for the incidents, or I'm sorry, the injuries, and then same thing on the low consequence side. Now, as I mentioned, the low consequence side, you see a little just more subject matter expertise input, because this we use internal data for this. And so, and also, as I mentioned, there's no safety impacts for the low consequence. So it's naturally zero. So stepping through a little bit further, like I said, won't go into too much detail about the others because the process is the same. You can kind of see where we go with the financial. Same thing. We have a baseline incident cost. And what that means is for a medium pressure incident, we, as a company, we have to go investigate it. We have to remediate it. As a baseline, we're looking at this baseline cost that we know we will likely spend in order to, I'm sorry, did I hear somebody? Somebody have a question? Maybe not. Okay. That we're going to have to spend during an incident. And then for ramp purposes, we obviously exclude shareholder costs and things like that. We went to National Day and said, well, on average, how much kind of property damage do we see from these type of events? Use that. And then again, for our SoCalGas territory, since property values are a lot higher out here, especially in the LA area, we used a multiplication factor to up that sort of financial impact to be more associated with SoCalGas. Same thing, you get your assumed financial cost per incident for each sub-event, and then that all goes into the MAVF. So you can see down here, again, if we trace the financial portion of it, comes down to your expected values. Same thing for reliability, same thing for stakeholder satisfaction. The reliability portion, we used our own historical analysis of what kind of events we see, subject matter expertise of what we think a potential medium pressure incident could result in terms of meters out, and we derive that expected value as such. Curtailment, we're not going to see curtailment for medium pressure because it's the medium pressure system. That's more on the high pressure side of things. So it's noted as zero here. And then a low consequence, obviously the threshold is 1 meter out. We're looking for reliability impacts. And then the stakeholder satisfaction, I know we've talked about this in workshops past, but essentially it's kind of a matrix approach. If we have this sort of event, we went to the subject matter experts and said, okay, if you're a customer, how much impact do you think we scale this result, and all of that pumps up into a index value, which we use then to calculate the core. So I know that was a lot. I know I went quick. I'm going to pause right there. Any questions overall the methodology we use to calculate risk score?
Yes. This is Steve Hain here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Could you please go to the safety lower portion of the screen, please?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Stop there. So you took this PHMSA data of 2.6 and you converted that into an annual rate.
Yes.
And then you combine that with your internal data to arrive at 2.74.
Yes.
And the methodology you used is to add those two together, and that kind of doesn't make sense to me. Why do you add them together instead of blend them together?
What do you mean blend?
Well, instead of taking some weighted average between the two, why are they added together? So it's 2.6 plus 0.1429, right? So the 2.6 is the PHMSA data, and the 0.1429 is this the internal company data?
Yeah, the after the meter incident rate.
But Are they referring to the same types of incidents or?
No, they're
different types?
two separate distinct things.
Okay, all right.
Correct.
That answers the question then.
Okay, great.
Um,
Yes, there are two. I'll just to kind of a little bit. There are two separate distinct events within this risk. So when we looked at enterprise risk and we looked at the medium pressure system, there's also beyond the meter and there's ahead of the meter. And in past, we've looked at having the risk as separate, having the risk as together. In this particular case, we put them together, and so that's what you're seeing here is essentially almost like a subdivision of these high consequence and low consequence sub-events.
Jeff, this is Tom Long from Turn.
Hey, Tom.
I have two questions about this work paper, and then I think our consultant, Dr. Lesser, will have another question.
Sure.
I'll start with, I think, the easiest one first. The distinction between high consequence and low consequence events.
Yes.
High consequence does not mean events that take place in high consequence areas, which is a term of art that in the regulations. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, Tom. It's the way to think about it is we also call it a hazardous incident. It's an incident that results in a safety impact or explosion or rupture. So I know that's a little confusing, so thank you for clarifying. It's not an HCA.
So by definition, in this spreadsheet, when you're referring to high consequence, it's just talking about whether or not there's a safety impact or not. High consequence is a safety impact, low consequence, no safety impact.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, that's the easy one. The next one is about the lure, following up on Steve Haynes' question. So the hazardous incidence number, the assumed value is 26 based on PHMSA data. Then it says hazardous incidents, SoCal gas. And when you were speaking a moment ago, you said you use national data tailored to SoCal gas. So I don't know what that line means, hazardous incidents, SoCal gas. Can you explain that?
Yeah, good question. So if the data exists for SoCal gas, in this case, it does. We have a good data set nationally about SoCal gas. So this is basically 26 incidences, high consequence incidences or hazardous incidences that have been reported to PHMSA just for SoCal gas. When that doesn't exist, so like compressor data, we don't have any reportable incidents in the recent past about compressors. We don't have anything internally that matches this hazardous type for compressors. We then just looked nationally and said, well, what's the rest of the country look like? And then, if appropriate, we tailored to SoCal gas. So I know that's a little confusing, but I'll say this: if it says SoCal gas, in general, it means that's actually what PHMSA says about SoCal gas or SDG.
Okay, so just to paraphrase and to see if I understand that, that line that you've got highlighted now, those are only incidents that occurred on SoCal Gas's system. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. They happen to be reported to PHMSA. That's why you're using PHMSA as the basis, but they are SoCal Gas only incidents.
Yes, sir.
And then, but you said they're compressor incidents that. So that's I lost you a little bit. There's something where you are using PHMSA national data and not SoCal Gas only data, and what is that?
Yeah, that's so I know I kind of blended the two. That's more for high pressure. Obviously, we don't have compressor stations on the medium side, so that was just using that example. But if for the compressor incidences, it's two separate things. We have no reportable SoCal Gas compressor incidences, but we wanted to capture that risk. So that's where we went to national data, not just PHMSA about SoCal Gas. We went to PHMSA about the nation and other utilities and said, what does it look like nationally? What does it look like nationally? And then if we felt that we could tailor that to the company, then we did that. So what you're seeing on the screen, I'll clarify. What you're seeing on the screen, that didn't happen here in the likelihood. This is just SoCal Gas data in the national level and internal SoCal Gas data.
Okay, so what you were describing was more, maybe we'll see it on the high pressure.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm going to invite Dr. Lesser, Turn's consultant, to ask his question. I believe he had a question about the reliability attribute.
I do, but actually, Tom, I have another question that follows up from yours. Since you're saying that the hazardous incident data is actually SoCal Gas data specific, And I assume that includes where you say hazardous incidents that result in a fatality or injury, SoCal Gas. That's actually SoCal Gas, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so then why do you what's the purpose of the population density adjustment since you're already talking about SoCal Gas's territory? And you're talking about incidents that result in a fatality or injury that have occurred in SoCal Gas. Why multiply that?
That's a good question, and we debated whether or not we should do that. But we felt since it made sense to do, just because to provide a little bit more of a conservative approach to capture all of the territory. And so it's just one thing we did, and a methodology that we chose. And yeah, so I'll pause there. But yeah.
But doesn't that, okay, well, you're saying, okay, I'll leave it at that. And now on your reliability calculation for core, if you go back to cell D9 on your spreadsheet, and if you can see the equation there at the very top, where and this doesn't really matter for medium pressure since you assume zero curtailment. But on table 9 of page C16 of the ramp report, you established a minimum threshold for gas curtailment of 250 million cubic feet per day.
Yes.
But that's not reflected in your equation here. So for say the high pressure stuff or storage where you get 125 million assumed curtailment, that has a positive attribute score, even though it's far below your 250 million. So that equation appears to me to be wrong.
So it's actually the amount above 250 million. And so what that means is when we went to our subject matter experts and said, we need to develop some sort of, curtailment impact, what does that look like? It was reasonable to them that, well, a certain amount of curtailment we can handle as a company. If we have a small enough volume, there's likely enough either slack in the system to cover that, hopefully, in most cases, not all the time. And so that number was established at 250 to kind of represent like our system. If a pipeline goes out of service, it doesn't always mean we have curtailments. And that's what that value is. So what you're seeing in the 125, that's essentially 125 above the 250.
So when we see the zero in this case, is that 250 then or just zero?
That's just whole zero, not zero above 250, if you will.
All right, thank you. That's certainly not clear in your ramp report at all.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. I think that's our questions for now on this work paper.
Sure.
Hey, Jeff, I have one more question.
Yes, sir.
Going back to the same area of the question, why is SoCal Gas including after the meter data? Okay, maybe I didn't understand the risk adequately. After the meter data that's customer asset, that's not really part of the risk, is it?
So it is part of this risk. So when we look at enterprise risk as a company, there are two. You can divide it if you want and say, well, everything above the meter is medium pressure, and everything beyond that's the customer side. Which you're right, it is. It's a yard line, but we still have employees that go into customer homes, maybe relights, customer asset installs, things like that. Sometimes there are yard leaks, which a lot of times we'll respond to. And so we wanted to capture that risk as well here. And it made sense to do it in the medium pressure system and say, because the medium pressure system essentially everything less than 60 pounds, which would be 60 pounds all the way through to the customer. And so that's why we captured it here.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So
I wanted to butt in on a previous question talking about the use of national data with regard to safety. You're no longer talking about likelihood. You base the likelihood on your own SoCal gas incidents, but to model consequences in the core, my understanding is you wanted to take a bigger pie to look at the possible range of consequences that can happen from an event like this. So you went with the national data to give you a more a better, total database of results to call on. Is that correct?
yeah, that's a good way to put it. We wanted to be as encompassing and thorough and as possible with our data and to capture those consequences. So it made sense to go nationally and see what is everybody else doing, because we don't, I mean, essentially we did that for a lot of the risks, because we don't want to just be like, well, what's only happening here? So you are seeing that sort of expansion of the consequence to look not just internally, but externally as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. And I have I guess you're saying now that for the medium, or for the, I guess what we're looking at now, you're saying you didn't use national, you used only SoCal gas data. And what did you say was the, how do we determine that from your work papers?
Okay, let me see if I understand. So if in some cases we do use national data, in some cases we do use internal data, in some cases we look at nationally what our data shows, and that is based on column D and F. So if you're looking at our work paper, you can say, okay, hazardous incidents, which is a rupture resulting in a big or serious injury. Oh, SoCal gas from PHMSA. And then, so you should go, okay, that's, they're saying it's SoCal gas data at the national level, or what's been recorded to PHMSA essentially.
But I'm sorry, what I'm trying to understand is how we can determine that. Is it just when it says comma SoCal gas in the metrics section, or
yeah, it's a combination.
How is it that we can see that?
Definitely, it's a combination of the metrics and basis section. So the way I would read it, I guess, is if I was coming along like this and said, okay, they're high consequence, what are they actually making this up of? Okay, hazardous incidents, oh, for SoCal gas. Oh, at the PHMSA level, from the basis section. So I would interpret that these are SoCal gas hazardous incidents that have been reported to PHMSA. If we look at something else, we can say, let's see, so maybe assumed fatalities per incident, and then SME input. So if this is low consequence safety, just for everybody following along. Okay, so it's an assumed fatalities per incident. Oh, they use subject matter expertise. So that's obviously only applicable to SoCal gas, or a subject matter expert divides that value. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm sorry if it doesn't. I can try to.
It really doesn't. And the reason that it concerns me is because we commented on SoCal Gas's 2019 ramp that utility-specific data needs to be used, and it needs to be transparent and disclosed and understandable. And I'm having trouble, even as you're explaining it right now, understanding when utility-specific data is used and when it isn't. Is there another location that is better than what you're showing right now that can help me ascertain that? Because, you are supposed to use, you are required to use utility-specific data when available. And my concern is when you started talking, you were talking about using national data, and then you said, oh, well, no, that's mainly for high pressure. Well, that's concerning because for the high pressure, there's all sorts of utility-specific data, very specific data that you have. And so it should be less need for national data in the high pressure scenario than not. So I think we're suffering from the same problems as the last ramp, is what it seems like to me.
Okay. Let me try to respond with that. So when we are calculating and looking at expected value, we go to what data is available. So if we do have internal data, we'll use it. If we feel that we don't have enough data to represent it properly, we'll go nationally. So I used that compressor incident earlier. We don't have compressor, we haven't had a high consequence compressor incident in the company. So in order to more accurately get an expected value of what that might look like, we went nationally for it. Now, what I'll also say is, when we say subject matter expertise, that's just not somebody saying, well, I think it's this for that reason. It's a process of us discussing it with the business units and their experience to say, based on what you know about the company and the data that's available to you, what number seems reasonable here, if it's not available nationally or some other proxy. So to your earlier point about where can I see that, I think the work papers is the best spot. Reading from metric and basis and putting those two cells together to point you into where this actually came from.
Hey Jeff,
Yes.
This is Joe. I think, as you said, if it's SME input, I think that's self-explanatory that is, employees providing data. I think part of the confusion may be when we have PHMSA.
Sure.
If we look at row, I think that's 36, within column D, you have SoCalGas. You say PHMSA, and so could your answer be, to the extent somebody looks at column F and sees basis for data as PHMSA, then look at column D. If we have SoCalGas, it's SoCalGas as reflected in PHMSA. If you look at column or row 53, you see PHMSA, and then you look at column D and you see national. So, okay, that is data that we got from PHMSA, but it's data but it's national-based data and not SoCalGas. And so, in the instances where you see PHMSA, look in column D. If you see SoCalGas, that's SoCalGas data that was provided to PHMSA. And if you do not see SoCalGas, then it's not SoCalGas data from PHMSA.
That's a good way to look at it, Joe. Thank you for that. Yes, it's exactly how I would describe it.
So another question. So basically, on this one, there's only only one that does, or two that have SoCalGas. So you only used utility-specific data twice on this slide. Is that right?
Well, so here, yeah, we have SoCalGas data here. This is also internal SoCalGas data. Anywhere that it says internal data or subject matter expertise is internal data or internal interpretations of data and expertise.
Okay. Then following up on a question, I'm not sure who asked it, but it was Turns expert. The idea that you would be using SoCalGas data and adjusting for SoCalGas is very, it seems like some sort of inflation of something. That doesn't make any sense. It's just at all. Can you explain a little bit more about how you guys reached the conclusion that you should make adjustments if you are using your data?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe that is, when we look at expected value, we're only as good as the data we have. And so when we looked at a data set and we go, well, do we feel that truly represents what could happen here as a consequence in SoCalGas? Sometimes the answer is yes, and we don't touch it and we say that's a good representation. If we think it deserves a little bit more because of, like I said, population density or, what we're seeing in our system, the growth in our system, you know, new communities popping up, we might adjust that. And it's our way of saying, well, we want to try to be able to capture a wide breadth of consequences, and that's one of the ways to do it. So that's what you're seeing when we've expanded upon national SoCal gas data, trying to capture those variances and a greater understanding of what impacts could happen if something like this happened.
So you're assuming growth. Is that what I gather?
That's just one example. I'm just, there's a whole wide range of things that could say, well, I use growth because, obviously I think we all know there's a lot of growth going on, and we're seeing a lot of communities pop up that need service. And that could be one of the reasons we go, well, all this national data is 10 years past. We're looking towards the future. We're going to see all this growth. Maybe it makes sense to increase that a little bit. And so that's what we did.
That reminds me of my other question is, when you're looking at this data, you say that it goes, 10 years back, I think you just said? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
But during that time, the mitigation was in place, isn't that right?
What mitigation specifically?
So, okay. The, DIMP in this case, I guess it would be.
So maybe a better way to say it is, the SoCal gas subset of PHMSA data is small compared to the total of national data. So it's a starting point. And so when we look at that and we go, again, do we feel that's an accurate representation of expected value if something like this happens? Then we'll say, yeah, that's good. But if we look at that and go, maybe we should see if that increases a little bit due to the reasons I said, we'll add a factor in there. It's just, like I said, it's just a way to get a better representation.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to move on from the national data versus not. I was more wondering how you took into consideration the existence of a of a mitigation measure that's been in place for a long time in this context. But maybe I should wait for later in the workshop to follow up on that one.
Yeah, so what I'll say is, this is a snapshot in time. This is our best representation of what residual risk we have on the system. So when we look at risk, we look at it in two different ways, or multiple ways, but at the enterprise level, we look across our enterprise and go, what risk do we have for the enterprise? What you're seeing in our ramp report is essentially a trunking, if you will, of these different risks: medium pressure, high pressure, storage. And when we calculate risk, we're looking at that moment in time and say, based on everything that's happening right now, our mitigations, what we know from the past, and what we think might happen in the future, this is what our risk score is. All of that can change, obviously, as maybe events happen, maybe something where we've identified a new threat, something like that. So I'm just trying to paint you the picture that this is it's a snapshot in time, representative of everything we're doing thus far and of the residual risk we have left on the system. So hopefully that sort of kind of clarifies where you were going with that next question.
It really doesn't, but I'll follow up later in the workshop, and I appreciate the effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in briefly. There could be some confusion between determination of likelihood of a risk and the consequences if that risk occurs. And what we're seeing here is that to figure out what the consequences of an event could be, the company is looking at national incidents for a broader range of possible outcomes, possible consequences. And that's where the use of national data is really helpful, because there are generally fortunately very few incidents occurring in SoCalGas's own territory. But to see what the possible consequences of such an event might be, they look at the national data and they want to make use of that to give a broader picture of what the possible consequences could be. But since it's national data, they ask themselves, is there anything about this national data that should be adjusted for the conditions that we have here locally? And so that's what they're doing in some cases. They're adjusting the national data and saying, if there was a financial consequence and so many $1 million is what the cost was nationally, but we can observe from our own local conditions that that cost would be higher because we have higher property values, for example, then we're going to make an adjustment to the national data to reflect how could it be experienced here in our territory. So I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I felt like maybe that explanation wasn't coming out clearly.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, that's exactly it. I appreciate the jump in.
And then, and this is Joe, and I think, and again, hopefully I can be as successful as Fred in channeling Jeff. When we calculate the likelihood, it's the likelihood, as Jeff said, as a point in time. That point in time is when we did that calculation, let's say, when, 5, 6 months ago, 7 months ago. And when we had the discussions at that time, it was a likelihood reflecting our system at that time. And to the extent we had been doing a mitigation for either 1 year, 2 years, 5 or 10 years prior to that point in time, that is incorporated because it's the likelihood of a event happening based upon the situation at the time we do that analysis. So it would take into consideration all the mitigations that we would have been doing up to that point.
Correct.
All right, Jeff, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
If there's no other questions, and it was really good discussion, I think now we want to go into the quant specific to the one mitigation. And
Sure.
I had offered, or I suggested, I think the VIMP, the Vintage Integration Plastic Program. Are you able to do that one?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, everybody. That's great discussion. Love it. Let's transition now to kind of how we do RSCs. I think we've had a lot of talk about this through our previous workshops and things like that. I think in the last one, I walked through specifically kind of formulas and how we did it in the PowerPoint. I'll be honest, I probably glazed over it myself. It was a lot of formulas, so we're going to walk through it here a little bit. As I mentioned, this is our supplemental work paper. So this tab you're seeing here is essentially what we provided on the second round. And it's fairly straightforward in that you can follow the formulas and see what values it's calling to. Again, if we kind of see tracing to our RSC value, we see what we're using is this idea of what we're calling the percent method. We identify how much for a particular mitigation, how much risk we're addressing. Of that mitigation, what's your scope look like? Of that mitigation, how effective do we believe it is? And then how long do we think we're going to see, a benefit for it? All of that essentially gets multiplied by the pre-mitigated risk score over the cost times the readability factor, and you get your RSC. And that's what I'm kind of showing here. Now, what you're seeing in here in the formulas, it's just a present value formula for the 3% discount that we had talked about previously. It sort of discounts your risk reduction benefits here. And this is all just in one formula across this sheet here. Now, what you might be more familiar with is the first sheet that we had given essentially does the same thing. It just shows you a little bit different on how to do it. You get the same value, but it's your risk reduction, and you can see here times your discounted time, if you will, over your total cost times your readability factor. Now, what I will say is the key to do it is this percent risk address, percent mitigation scope, percent effectiveness. Now, I want to talk a little bit about those and how we determine those. You can see from, I know I keep switching back and forth, sorry about that. For the data sources in the first, this was the tier 1 that we provided. We kind of give you, hey, where did all this stuff come from? It's historical, it's company forecast data, it's historical leak data, it's SME input and so forth, and so on and so forth. So at least you know where we're pulling from to get these values. Now, I'll walk through how we sort of look at risk address and percent mitigation scope and effectiveness. And then when I'm done with that, we'll talk questions and things like that. So in order to do this methodology, you obviously need your risk score. So we got that lower score for your integrated risk score. You need your percent risk addressed, your percent scope, and your percent effectiveness. To get your risk addressed, one of the methods that we use, and I think in particular with this one as well, is we looked at, of all the incidences nationally that we used to develop our consequence here, how many of those were due to certain drivers. So in PHMSA, you can pull that up and you can say, well, this is due to corrosion, and this is due to incorrect operations. This is due to something else. You get the point. So the percent risk addressed is essentially, we looked at all of the incidents that would fall under this risk purview. So that would be medium pressure beyond the meter, any sort of incident, low consequence, high consequence, and then how many were actually caused by what this program is mitigating. So in this case, it's a wholesale replacement of pipe. So you're going to hit corrosion, you're going to hit any sort of weld or joint failure, any sort of construction problems, or even some incorrect operations, if you will. So essentially, in short, the risk addressed is, we looked at national data and we said, this is your risk pie. Essentially, you have so many incidences, and of all these incidents, they're caused by ABC, and so your risk is essentially your percentage of address are those incidents that happen. Now the scope is a little bit more straightforward. That's essentially what the program's doing. So in this case, for VIP or the DIMP programs, it's replacement. We're replacing non-state-of-the-art pipe, and pipeline integrity folks on the line, keep me honest. That's what we're doing in the program in a nutshell. So your scope is essentially, what is the universe of risk under this umbrella of medium pressure? All non-state-of-the-art, well, in this case, plastic pipe. And then your scope is, what are you actually doing over the next GRC cycle to replace? How many? So we'll use miles example. There's umpteen thousand miles. Again, I'm just for illustrative purposes, we're going to replace 1.37% of those miles. Effectiveness. Essentially, a lot of this is subject matter expert driven. How effective is it to do this mitigation? And so we had a lot of conversations with the operations folks, like, what does that mean? In this case, we've developed a percentage over 100%. I know you're probably asking, well, how does that make sense? Well, it makes sense because we've targeted the most risky pipe in the system. So your effectiveness essentially would be over 100% because you're going to the worst case scenario. So hopefully that makes a little sense on that. We can talk a little bit more about that, but essentially it's that. If you just went out and started replacing pipe with no thought about it, you wouldn't be super effective. But if you're targeting the risky pipe, it's going to be more effective than you would just replacing normal pipe. And then you see your benefits lifetime. A lot of these figures were developed, especially for the asset side, or the accounting, kind of sort of the book life, if you will, of the pipe. We use 68 years, discounted for the 3% over the total cost, and you get your RSC. So it's essentially how the workbook works, if you will. That's how we're calculating RSCs, and those are the components of each RSC that we've developed.
Jeff, this is Tom. Is this a good time for a question?
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Tom.
This is Tom from Turn. I think we have several questions about this work paper. I'll begin by saying thank you for starting to explain what the columns percent risk address, percent mitigation scope, and percent effectiveness mean. I didn't see that explained anywhere in the work papers or in the report. Did I miss something?
So I believe we spoke a little bit more in general, but not specifically about, hey, this particular one is derived from these values in the report.
And we don't need to spend long on this, but I didn't see that anywhere in what those columns represented, discussed anywhere. So we were just left to guess what that even means. But now now the next question is how these values were derived. And so let's look at percent risk address. So if I understood your explanation, you're saying this is a percent that reflects some percentage derived somehow of someone's view that let's look at the bare steel one. That's 10. That this mitigation replacement of bare steel pipe is going to address 10.2% of the drivers or I guess you said the incidents that are that this mitigation addresses.
Mhm.
So you said like corrosion should be addressed and other things. But I guess the specific question is, where can we see what that? I think if you click on 10.2, you'll just see it's a number. It's a plug value. It's not. It doesn't tell us where you got that and how you calculated that. Does it?
So the overarching process is we discussed about RSCs and how we derive things is in ramp C. How we specifically derived these values here. Sorry. So we give you what data we use to derive that, but we didn't. So I think in some of the discussions internally, that data we looked at and we did an internal review regarding, what we were saying, how those numbers were derived, and it was deemed confidential. And so that's what we've been working through on this. And so that's why you're not seeing it here.
So for example, if we could go back to the previous work paper we were looking at, the 10.2% value.
Yes.
So that's what someone's assessment of what drivers are being addressed. I don't see anything in the work papers that says what drivers this mitigation is supposed to address. Is that identified anywhere?
Not in this work paper, no.
Okay. And then again, nothing to show how that value was calculated based on what drivers were being addressed.
No.
Okay. All right.
And
Tom, this is Joe. And I think part of our approach was to allow stakeholders to use the discovery process for mitigations that they had that level of granularity for questions to ask us. If we would have provide that level of data for every one of these data points would have been extremely voluminous within the ramp report. And we felt it would have been data for a lot of mitigations that were not as high priority in stakeholders' mind. Yes, we took that assumption. And so it's to utilize the discovery process for which specific mitigations, which specific data would you like to know that information?
Well, we got this information from PG&E, and we didn't have to ask data requests. They told us what drivers they thought were being addressed, and they gave us backup work papers for it. So we're struggling with the amount of information you've given us, and the data request process has been lengthy and it's been hard to get answers that we've been able to work with. So sorry that hasn't been working well for us. But let's go to the next column, percent mitigation scope. So that's just the percent of the system that's being addressed. That's being for these are pipe replacement programs. The percent of the system pipe that's being replaced. Is that right?
In this particular case, I should say percent of the universe of risk out there. It's not the entire system, but it's what is the riskiest pipe.
All right. So for vintage pipe, I believe I read your report, and for plastic pipe, you have like 25,000 or so miles of plastic pipe. Is that right?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll take your word for it. Yeah.
I'm just looking at my notes. Yeah, 25,000 miles of plastic mains. So this would be the percent of 25,000 plastic mains that are being replaced in this rate case period?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. On that one, I'm not complaining about, if that's what that means, then that's understandable. Though it would be nice to have something in the cell that showed how that was calculated instead of it just being a plug value. I think again, if you click on that, you don't see where it's derived from, so we wouldn't have had to guess. But now I understand.
Yeah. Just to clarify, 25,000 miles of mains and services.
Oh, so, and it's okay, thank you. Percent effectiveness. I honestly didn't understand. We did, you anticipated our question. 100, how do you get to more than 100% effective? But I didn't understand your answer. I'm sorry.
Sure, I can try again. So the idea is that in these type of programs, they specifically target more risky pipe. So if you're looking at two sets of, we'll just say two plastic segments, you have a state-of-the-art and a non-state-of-the-art. If you go in and replace your non-state-of-the-art, you're essentially doing more risk reduction than you would if you went in and just replaced an old state-of-the-art pipe. And so that's how we get over the 100% sort of risk reduction, because we're specifically targeting beyond just the mean, just beyond the mean risk. We're targeting riskier pipe, if you will, or riskier assets.
So this is Tom. Can I just interrupt and ask a question of him?
Please.
So Jeff, I guess following up on Tom's question, it seems then Sempra or Southern California Gas, somehow you've created different tranches of let's say plastic pipe that has different risks, but that's not reflected in how you've done your tranches. And the other thing is how do we determine, how do we validate that these percentage effectiveness numbers? They seem very precise. For example, cathodic protection, 724%. The base replacement program, it's 387%. That's a rather precise number, but we have no idea how you actually did that calculation internally.
Yeah. So what I'll say first about the tranching. So I think we've mentioned this past. These activities are almost, as we put it, pre-tranche. You're looking at a more risky subset of pipe in the system, especially in these DIMP programs. So the activity in itself is the tranche. Now, going to the effectiveness values, and to Joe's point, we didn't provide that in a data request form. We can certainly talk about that and provide the information that we did to arrive at those values. What I can say here is, in essence, we looked at how we could quantify to get, how do we actually capture something that we're doing on a more risky set of pipes. So I'll give you an example on the BIP one. So what we actually did is we looked at internal leak data, and we found that at a certain ratio that non-state-of-the-art pipe leaks at a certain rate versus state-of-the-art pipe. And so looking at those two rates, we're able to sort of devise a multiplication factor to, increase your effectiveness above 100%. And the same goes for some of the other ones you're seeing here that's above the 100%. We looked at internal data and said, okay, for CPL, say, things that are cathodically protected versus not cathodically protected. If you go out there and remediate something that's not cathodically protected, you're doing something, risk targeted, and you're doing something greater than just the mean pipe that is cathodically protected. So again, with that one, we looked at leak rates as well. So that there is data behind those numbers.
So Jeff, do these three columns we just looked at, do these somehow play into the calculation of the effectiveness of the mitigation in reducing the frequency of the event? In other words, the change in lure?
Yeah. So one way, there's multiple ways to look at it. And as I mentioned in the previous workshop, I kind of gave those equations. One of the ways is we're targeting your likelihood. We're trying to remediate how often this happens. And so one way to look at this is if your score remains constant, which in this case it does, your percent can be applied just to the lure side, or it can be applied to the whole risk score side. So what you see in the formula here on my computer, it's applied to the risk score because it's just one formula. But in the secondary, or the first sheet, you're looking at the percent risk reduction, and it's targeting the lower part of it. So it's, to your question, yeah, it targets the lower. You can look at it, you can slice and dice it multiple different ways, but essentially it does do that.
Okay, but here's my question, my nuts and bolts question. and Jonathan, feel free to jump in. On the spreadsheet you just jumped to, the RSE summary, there's a very important number, percent change in lure. And we click on that and is that the one we're having trouble with, Jonathan? It's, sorry, I'm just.
No, you want column Q, post-mitigated lure.
Post-mitigated lure, yeah, that's right, post-mitigated lure. We click on that and it just is a value. It's just a plug value. It doesn't show the equation or the inputs that gave us that. I assume that post-mitigated lure is somehow related to these columns we've been looking at in the other spreadsheet, the percent effect, the percent risk address, the percent mitigation scope, the percent effectiveness.
Yes.
But I don't know how they're related. You're not telling us how.
So what I'll say to that is like I said, there's different ways to do this. This is just one showing of how to do that, and this is another showing of how to do that. But what you can do, because we know, as I said, we know that the core is constant. This essentially this section here, and you're seeing in the formula percent, you can multiply that to get your risk reduction just by the pre-mitigated lure, and you can essentially take the difference. You're right, we don't show that, but you can back out that value with these numbers in this sheet.
Okay, slow down, Jeff. This is what we're trying to understand. And so what do we multiply in order to get the change in lure?
So you can essentially, if you look on this one, you can take this section of the formula, the percent, and you can multiply it by the pre-mitigated lure, and that's going to give you the change in lure, I think. But we can run it right now.
Let's do it for the plastic pipe, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. And keep in mind, this workbook, there is some round off error, so it's not going to be precise, but you get it.
Tom, I'm also going to, while Jeff is doing that, I'm also going to mention, and I'm not sure if it's applicable to this work paper, but to the extent we were asked to provide work papers that had confidential data, to remove the confidential data. So then parties would have those work papers with only the confidential data. There may be instances where some of your questions are answered by having access to the confidential data, to the spreadsheets with the confidential data. And I'll just leave it at that.
But you've never offered us, you've never said that there's confidential work papers available.
We said that there are confidential issues, and you said, please provide us the data without the confidential data. Please provide us this, we don't want to sign an NDA. Please provide us the spreadsheets, removing the confidential data, and we'll see if that meets our needs. That's what you asked for. That's what we've provided.
No, we've asked for the work papers, and we've had issues about your NDA, but it didn't seem like it was mattering because the work papers that you provided you never indicated that there were any confidential work papers other than cybersecurity. We know that that's a different one, but other than that, we've never been told that there are confidential work papers that would provide more information.
And to follow up on that, this is Melinda from Protect Our Communities. There really shouldn't be. The whole point of this process is to be more transparent, and that's a very concerning statement to hear that well, maybe that you would understand it if you saw what was confidential. That's the exact opposite of what we're trying to do here.
Sorry for the confusion. There were data that was confidential, and talking with the stakeholders, they said, we prefer not to sign an NDA. If you can remove the data that's confidential and then provide us the spreadsheets, that's what we request, because we're not interested in signing an NDA. That's what we provided.
Joe, that is just
to be fair.
If you would like us to follow up and say the spreadsheet we provided only contains the non-confidential data, if you sign an NDA, we will provide you the the data, the spreadsheet with the confidential data that we redacted, we will do that.
Protect our communities. Sorry, Tom. Go ahead.
I think you were going to make the point I was going to make. So go ahead, Melinda.
Well, I was just for our point. We feel we cannot sign an NDA because we represent the public interest, and the public is the ones who are supposed to have a right to know and understand where their money is being spent. So it's not a preference. It's a principle, and it's a requirement.
Okay, and my point is, that's a good one, but in addition, I fail to see, and it's Melinda's previous point, why understanding what drivers Sempra, SoCalGas believes are addressed by a plastic pipe replacement program, and how you calculated the 10.2 and 20.58% numbers, how that could possibly be confidential information. That makes no sense at all. We just went over a previous spreadsheet where you're sharing similar information. Now this information, that what lies behind this, which is the guts of how you get to the effectiveness value, which I guess in the background, Jeff, I hope is still working on helping us understand how we get there. It boggles my mind that could somehow be claimed to be confidential.
Tom, this is Elliot. I'm sure folks can hear me. It's the first time talking on here. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there may be some. I think there may just be some confusion about what's confidential and what's not. I want to clear it up, before speaking out of turn. But I don't think there is a confidential version of the work paper you're looking at that has the formula in there, and we just didn't, and that we weren't providing the formula in there for that reason. So I don't think that that's what happened here, and but we'll clear it up with the team and make sure that's right.
Thank you, Elliot.
So going back to kind of your question, Tom, I don't necessarily want to run through the Excel because it's giving me some headaches, but what I will say is if you follow along, I can talk through it and hopefully you can duplicate on your side. So the whole point is everything you need to get those values. I think specifically we're talking about the post-mitigated lore. You can get that from this formula here. So the percent essentially is embedded in here. And right here, what we're showing is you're multiplying it by the pre-mitigated risk score to get your risk reduction. Obviously, then your benefits lifetime, so on and so forth. But
Jeff, can you hang on just a second?
Yeah,
what
sure.
Cell, it's hard for me to see. It's kind of small. What cell are you on for that formula?
Let me zoom in a little bit here. So I'm on the RSC per million for VIP, and the formula I'm speaking to is at the top of my screen now, and you can track.
Hang on a second.
Sure.
So you're on the I can't even see the tab. Which that's the RSE work paper, right?
Yes, sir.
And which cell?
M17.
M17.
Let me see if I can zoom in even further. Sorry about that. Problems of the digital world. Okay, so I've clicked on the formula, but it's M17. It's the RSC. RSC is 1.16, but the formula here to get the RSC is here. And we tried to make it easier by labeling your variable so you can easily know what's happening here. And so the way the RSC is calculated here is we take the present value, obviously the 3% discount, which I talked about, to discount our benefits. But the heart of it, the percent risk address, percent mitigation scope, percent effectiveness, that all gets multiplied by the pre-mitigated risk score. And that essentially gets you your risk reduction. And then obviously you take that across the benefit lifetime, and then over the cost, you get the RSC. But I think specifically to your question is on the other slide, or on the other sheet, we only had the hard-coded post-mitigation lore. But if you take this formula, you can take the percent, and multiply it by the pre-mitigated lore, and you will essentially get your change. Actually, what you should do is you should take your pre-mitigated lore, times it by 1 minus percent of the pre-mitigated lore. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. But you will get the post-mitigated lore by manipulating this equation here.
Okay, hoping that that Dr. Lesser is listening and we'll digest that. While we're, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, feel free to submit something if you want to go deeper and dive, and we can certainly write and talk all that out.
I would just say you can kind of make sense of what the end result is. If you applied this formula, if you apply those like 3 percentages, you multiply all those together, it's going to generate kind of a small fraction. And then when you go over on his other tab where he shows the result in terms of the risk reduction or the post-mitigated score, if you compare post-mitigated LOR to pre-mitigated LOR, see there's a very small difference. So it kind of makes sense just thinking it through in your head that when you multiply those percentages times each other, it'll be a small fraction. And what you're seeing is the LOR is changing by a very small amount, right? You're changing it I can't remember what the number was, but I just hope that'll help. And when you go through the formula, it'll start to make sense when you see what the result of it is, and that coincides with their number in the other tab of the post-mitigated LOR is slightly smaller than the pre-mitigated LOR due to the small overall impact. I think they're saying they're only affecting like 1.something% of their total exposed risk for the pipeline. So hopefully that helps you understand that you've arrived at the right calculation result when you can match those things up.
Yeah, as I say, we'll have to see if that works for us. If it helps us understand things. I want to shift to a different topic that's raised by the two highlighted programs, the vintage plastic program and the spare steel replacement program. So in this rate case period, and I looked at the report. Looks like for the plastic program, you're planning to address in a 3-year period somewhere between 270 and 327 miles of the plastic pipe in the system. There is the number I saw in the report that says there are about 25 miles of plastic mains and services. Actually, you said you qualified that, but I have the number 25,000. So some percent of plastic pipe is being replaced. Probably in the 1% range, according to that number on this work paper. What I don't understand from the report and the work papers. Well, first let's talk about tranches. The only tranching for here is between bare steel pipe and vintage plastic pipe, right? That's the only tranching you've done for those two types of pipe. Is that right?
So I just want to be clear on that. So yes, this program, the DIMP program, we're treating it as a tranche itself. So you have your BSRP, which is a tranche, and then you have your VIP, which is a tranche, kind of back to our tranching discussion back in November. But then you can look at these other activities as pre-tranche as well. So in essence, yes.
Okay, but somehow you've decided, even though you have 25,000 miles of plastic pipe, somehow you've decided to focus on between, let's just call it approximately 300 miles, 100 miles a year in this rate case period. And presumably that's because you think some of the pipe is higher risk, some of the pipe that hasn't been remediated yet in the system or replaced is higher risk and needs to be addressed ahead of other pipe. And so that's based on some sort of risk analysis. In fact, your report refers to something called the DREAMS, D-R-E-A-M-S tool, which is used to prioritize risk mitigation. I'm quoting now, used to prioritize risk mitigation on early vintage plastic and steel pipe segments. There's a risk algorithm that includes pipe attributes, operational conditions, and potential impact on population. The results of the analysis determine appropriate action to address risk for each segment and prioritize replacement investments based on a failure analysis. So you're using, the company in managing that program uses a a tool called the DREAMS tool to decide which pipe to prioritize, right?
Tom, this is Joe, and that leads right into when I gave the cadence for the discussion. I mentioned Jeff would be doing the quant analysis, which he's done. And then after we did the quant analysis, our integrity management team would talk about what they do. And so your question leads right into the next aspect of the presentation, if you will. So it's
let me then go back to the quant side. So because of there's the plastic, again, let's focus on plastic pipe, because that program is not broken down into any more granular tranches. We have we don't know, you haven't done anything, and it's not reflected anywhere in the work papers that shows for a given high priority part of the system or high risk part of the system, this is what this was the effectiveness that we would get, et cetera, from or this is the risk that we're dealing with, the higher risk that we're dealing with, the pre-mitigation risk score. And this is how the program would address that risk. It's not broken down in the work papers based on this DREAMS tool that's referred to in the testimony. Is that right?
So let me try and respond to that. Explicitly to your question, as the showing here is in the ramp, it's not broken down on a segment by segment basis. Your showing isn't. Now that doesn't mean that we don't do that, but I think what the thing we have to realize here is that the way it starts is we look at risk at an enterprise level, and that's what the ramp does. And so we look across the totality of risks to our enterprise, not just pipeline, and not just those pipeline methodologies that we use to prioritize work to be done. And so in essence, what you're seeing is the risk itself is a tranche, medium pressure pipeline. I spoke a lot about, medium pressure versus, beyond the meter. You could split those out too. And then furthermore, our mitigation, you can view all of those as separate tranches as well. Now, specific to DIMP, and I'm not going to speak, I'm going to let our pipeline integrity folks speak a lot more about what they do and how they do it. But the tranche itself is the program. So we've looked within these medium pressure assets and said, we know that these assets are more risky, or that there's an issue, or that we need to replace them. And so we look at that at the program level. So enterprise risk looks at things at the program level, and then our internals look at things more granular. Now, I think what you might be getting at is, why aren't we seeing that here in the ramp? And it's because these processes are complementary. We look at things at the enterprise level one way, and we look at things operationally another way. Now, I think, again, I just wanted to provide that kind of context about what we're doing and why we see it the way we do. But specific to how DREAMS is prioritized and things like that, I would definitely defer to the pipeline integrity folks on the line.
Okay, I'll just in response to that, I'll just note, and I'll look forward to the discussion by the integrity management people, but the settlement in row 14 says that the tranches are supposed to be based on how the risks and assets are managed for the utility. And you have a way of managing them that's using this DREAMS tool that I just referenced from your ramp report, but it's not reflected in the RSCs, how the RSCs are only done at the very, very aggregated level, and they're not done on the granular level that reflects your operations, how you manage them in real life. So this distinction between enterprise and operations, I don't see reflected in the settlement. In fact, the settlement says it's supposed to be based on how you manage the risks. That's just a comment in response to what you said.
So what I can offer to that is, when we developed our ramp report, we were mindful of the purpose, which is, the ramp phase of the GRC. It's to enable the commission to evaluate our reasonableness of the utility and our risk quantification methods and our risk mitigation measures. So we looked at, if we attempted to prepare what you're talking about, a segment level sort of analysis in the ramp work paper, not only would that be impractical or infeasible, it doesn't make sense. Now, I know, I hear what you're saying about kind of, that's, you do this, but it's, you quote how we manage our business. We do it both ways. we manage things at this high level, at the enterprise level, and we manage things at the lower level too. And I'll just briefly touch on forecasting in our work, but all of that's taken into consideration when we do our forecast. And so when we look at forecasting, we know we have this universe of risk that we have to address. And so that's what kind of sets up, or your percent mitigation scope. Then based on how our historical, project basis is, compliance type deadlines, things like that, that all kind of sets up how our dollars and units are formed. So I'll pause there and hopefully the integrity management can give a little bit more clarity on what I mean by that. But yeah.
Before we segue, Jonathan, Dr. Lesser, do you have any follow-up questions about the quant side of things that Jeff just talked about?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, Tom, I understand. I can offline show how they're deriving the post mitigation lower values from these. So on the quantitative side, I understand what they're doing. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. But so no other questions.
I was muted. Do you have any questions about the greater than 100%?
I think I understand what they're trying to say in terms of why it's greater than 100%. What I find disconcerting is that we have no way of verifying that those numbers relative. They're saying it's greater than 100% relative, I believe, to the average overall of the entire, say, all the plastic pipe. What they're going to do is going to be 3.87 times more effective at reducing risk. At least that's how I interpret that number. If that's wrong, then I don't understand it. But more specifically, I have no idea how that number is actually calculated.
And Jeff, did Jonathan state correctly what the 370% number, for example, means?
Yeah, essentially, we were looking for ways to accurately quantify and capture the fact that we're doing a risk targeted program. And so one of the ways we did that was we looked at essentially, like you say, leak rates. How much more leaky is an old or vintage pipe versus state-of-the-art pipe. And in that internal analysis, we came up with a factor to say, well, if you're replacing it, based on that, you're going to have this sort of multiplication to that effectiveness. So that's what you're seeing in the over 100%. The long-winded way of saying, yeah, I think he's got it.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Because I still don't really understand the greater than 100%.
Sure.
Is this an attempt to affect the consequence side of the equation? Like to say that we expect greater than average reductions in consequence based on the mitigations that, or based on the riskiness of the pipe that we're replacing?
It's targeting the likelihood. So if we replace an old pipe, we will inevitably have a less likelihood that some incident is going to occur. And so the way we do that is we look at the effectiveness. That's the way to do it in RAMP and say, how do we capture that this program is not just like your normal program, it's actually targeting more risky assets. And so it's not necessarily attacking the consequence, it is still attacking the likelihood, but the fact that you're getting rid of the older pipe or the more vintage pipe should reduce your likelihood to a greater extent than just going out and replacing an older state-of-the-art pipe, if that makes sense.
So Jeff,
I guess that's confusing to me because the overall likelihood is based on total number of incidences, not an average. And so I'm struggling with how you can, if a bad thing happens 30 times a year, how can you reduce that event more than 30 times?
So it's not that you're reducing it more than 30 times. Conceptually, you're replacing the higher profile risk pipeline. So we're trying to capture that. And so it's, and obviously it's on the likelihood side. I'm trying to make sure I can, verbalize this so everybody understands it, kind of what our thought process was. But essentially, it's that if you have a less riskier pipe in the system, you're going to have less incidences. It's not like we're saying you're gonna ultimately erase all 30 incidences and then some. It's just saying that in this context of the work we're doing, we're seeing this greater effectiveness. So it's really about on the risk reduction. So you're widening that percent reduction, if you will. Since the risk itself is over everything, it's over all of medium pressure, not just non-state of the art, but everything. This program is only specifically targeting those type of assets and therefore those type of likelihoods of incidences. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. It's not like we're saying all 30 incidences and then some are eradicated.
Okay, well, maybe Jonathan understands this better. I'll follow up. Thank you.
Sure.
So Jeff, one last question.
Sure.
If and I know you haven't done it, but if you were to break down the vintage plastic pipe into tranches that were based on homogeneous risk profiles, I use that term because that's in the settlement, with the same lure and the same core, so you had much more granular tranches. And you were focused on the remaining highest risk tranche in the system for plastic pipe. This is the worst of the worst plastic pipe, the stuff that you think really has to go because it's the likeliest to fail, or because the consequences of failure, it's in a dense urban area, and whatever reason, it's really a serious pipe that you need to get rid of. If you were breaking things down that way, would you need to have a greater than 100% effectiveness percentage? Or is this an artifact of the fact that you're doing this on a overall system basis as opposed to the granular tranche basis?
So I just want to make sure I understand the question. It's not that this program itself is a tranche, and I just want to make sure that we've established that. But I'm just let me just think a little bit. Let me take some time to think about that. Can you?
Well, let's just make it concrete. This is a 100-mile-a-year program. Let's say for 2024, some period in the future, SoCalGas says there's 15 miles that stand out in having very high lure, very high core, very high risk score. We need to get those. And then there's another 15 miles after that are, not quite as bad. And then there's another 15 miles beyond that. They're, again, lesser characteristics. But so we have a progression of declining risk as we go from these sections of the system that I've been talking about, 15-mile chunks, let's say, just to be arbitrary. If we just focusing on, and we were doing RSE calculations for each of those sections or tranches, would we be talking about percent effectiveness values that are over 100%?
So I think you touched on a good point there, and let me start with that. You mentioned that this sort of, I think where you're going is this prioritization. You have this block of pipes you're going to address. The next year you're going to address this many pipelines, and this is where I think our pipeline integrity folks can talk a little bit better to it. But as I said before, this is a snapshot in time. That risk prioritization changes with different inputs. We reevaluate it internally every year, and so it's not a fixed amount. It's a fixed universe, but how that prioritization is, it shifts and changes. So forecasting out 5 years of we're gonna definitely do this segment doesn't really make sense in this context because things change, things update, the model updates, there's incidences outside and inside the company that maybe we need to change a little bit and where we're headed. And again, this gets a little bit more in how the integrity management programs are managed. But I just want to make that clear because it sounds like we're saying, well, we know everything, we know the universe, yes, but how that actually gets addressed changes, and it's a dynamic, moving process. And that's why I said before, this is a complementary process. These two processes are complementary. And so I to your question about do we think the effectiveness would still be 300% if we went to the segment level, I would say yes, in essence, because you're still addressing the most riskiest pipe. You're still going out there and at that moment, what we see is the riskiest pipe. You're going out there and you're taking care of it. So hopefully that adds a little more color to it and that makes a little bit more sense.
Well, let me just conclude this my questions on the quant stuff, returns questions, by saying we really want to see the backup information. And I know Elliot said you're going to talk internally, but getting that as soon as possible so that we can understand how these numbers in those 3 columns, those percent numbers were derived, as well as the lifetime benefit numbers, all those things that don't have any explanation of how they were calculated would be really helpful. And we'd like to get that as soon as possible.
And I would also add, is it possible to get a copy of this DREAMS program you were discussing, or is that confidential?
I'd have to take that back and talk internally with the team about that.
Jeff, this is Chris Parks with Cal Advocates. Can I ask you a couple of questions about this work paper before you move off of it?
Yes, sir.
Can you turn up your volume a little bit? We can barely hear you. Thanks.
Hang on just a moment. See if I can headset here. Bear with me just a second.
That's much better. Thanks.
Better? Okay. All right. Can you still hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, super. All right. Can you please zoom out on this slide a little bit, please? Okay.
A little bit more? Okay.
Little bit
Maybe.
more. So that you can see the risk score, the
sure.
pre-mitigated risk score, and then also still see the percent of the total RSE cost reduction on the far right.
There you go.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So if I'm comparing, so right now we've been talking about the DIMP highlighted in yellow, the vintage integrity plastic program, and also, and that would include outerlay pipe. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And then if I'm looking at that and I'm comparing that to a couple rows down, it talks about EPM replacement and installs. So if I'm comparing those two, I see percent risk addressed for the vintage integrity plastic program as 20.58%. And then for the EPM replacement install, it's 1.64%. Can you just explain, and then the overall, the pre-mitigated risk score is for this overall category, which is 3071 for all of these rows. But can you explain then how that percent risk address compares when you take that number 20.58 and you compare it to the EPM, how that number was derived in terms of it's affecting the reduction in risk?
Yes. So the EPM installs, right? Versus, just make sure, VIT versus EPM installs. Those are the two you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, fighting WebEx on the other screen. Okay. So as I mentioned previously, how this risk address sort of we calculated is we looked at from the risk scoring work paper, we have this, I'll just say, universe of incidents that occurred internally, externally. We looked at that. Now we looked at the risk address. Obviously, we're attacking this risk score. I shouldn't say attacking, but we're addressing this risk score with these mitigations that was derived from those incident data. So when we go to the risk address, we're essentially going, okay, if we have this mitigation, what portion does it actually address? What portion, I should say, what drivers does it actually address when doing this work? So each one of these is comprised of, okay, you have a certain number of incidents, hazardous or not, X number of incidences were caused by A, B, and C. Mitigation EPMs addresses A and B. And so you can attack that percentage is essentially out of that total number of incidents that have historically happened. That's that percentage you're seeing there. So that's how it differs a little bit. EPMs they might have some overlapping drivers that they address, but they're essentially doing that. Of the incidences we looked at, how many are we addressing of those incidents? And that's how we get that percent risk address.
Okay, so in looking at it from that standpoint, then I guess the Vintage Integrity Plastic Program, DREAMS program, is maybe in the upper percentages of risk address compared to this whole list, if you were to rank them in that column there. But then when I look at over on the far right, then the RSC per $1 million, it would say that for the program that's in the ramp, that the RSC for the vintage pipe program is 1.16 compared to the EPM, which is 106. So is that saying that you get a lot greater risk reduction then from the program that you're putting for EPM replacements as installed as compared to replacing plastic pipe?
So it's a good question. I wouldn't necessarily look at it as direct like that. So as I mentioned in the risk address, there's the certain number of incidences we are addressing. Those might overlap with what the integrity program is addressing. They might not. So it's not necessarily to look at it straight across from the risk address as an apples to apples comparison. We're trying to normalize it, but when you actually get down to it, it's a little bit, it could be the same driver's address. It couldn't be the same driver's address. Now, specific to your RSC question, essentially, or observation, what that says is, essentially for your, I kind of say, your bang for your buck, if you will, in that RSC. So the higher the RSC, that means you're getting a greater risk reduction, but it's also a factor of all three of these. So I want to make that very clear too. So if you say you're addressing 100% of your scope, like the GET program, I think we're starting to roll down on that and we're addressing it. Your RC is going to look really high because, wow, you did 100% of your scope. So those are some other factors to consider in it. And then even back to the VIT conversation, we have this greater than 100% effectiveness, but because of the high cost and obviously our low scope, it yields a lower RSC. So I think all of that to say, this is a tool. It's something to look at. It's something we utilize. It's not the end all be all in terms of making decisions, but it gives us a good sort of pulse on what we're seeing, at least in this terms of this methodology. So you really got to look at everything across to get the RSC to know what it means.
Oh, okay. And then one other question.
Sure.
In the percent effectiveness, like for example, with the plastic pipe, it shows 305%. That is all based upon kind of SME input. Is it based on any kind of metric that is being used to determine past mitigation effectiveness by replacing this plastic pipe? Are there any metrics that are used, or is it all just sort of, well, this is what we expect?
A combination. But what I'll say to that is, when we I mentioned this previously, when we looked at these effectivenesses for something like this, we looked at what's one thing you say metrics that we could kind of sort of pinpoint internally, and that's how much more leaky are we seeing for non-state-of-the-art pipe. And so essentially that ratio we can use and say, well, if you put a new state-of-the-art pipe in there, you're not going to have this much, you're not going to have leaks. And so utilizing that data, we're able to sort of kind of come up with this multiplication factor. Some of the other ones are a little bit more subject matter expertise. So it's a combination to answer your question. I think this is, we've discussed this, this is a hard number to quantify. How effective is a compliance program that's been in place for decades? And those are the type of questions we ask our subject matter expertise. And it's, how we ultimately answer that is how we get these numbers here. So in short, there is some data behind some of this. Some of this is subject matter expertise driven. But yeah.
Got it. And it might be a
Fred,
question for
Fred, I'd like to, I'm sorry for interrupting at this point, but I think looking at the schedule, looking at the timeline we had and where we are right now, I think it might be a good time to take a 5 or 10-minute break. And during that break, we can give some thought as to how we want to continue forward. We are quite a bit behind on this one to the extent we want to go over the high pressure, and there may be similar questions with the high pressure. But I think it'd be good for a 10-minute break, and then we can come back and we can have a discussion of what topics we want to discuss going forward.
Yeah. This is Elliot. And Chris, we don't mean to cut you off. You can certainly finish the questioning right after the break, to finish up the thought there, but just wanted to plug that in. We didn't mean to cut you off too much there.
Yeah,
I mean, I agree. We can we should take a break. People have some biological needs, if not other needs, to kind of put their heads together. Yeah, we're running a little over. My hope is that by doing the dives that we're doing into these sheets with the first risk, that a lot of the same questions would come up with the other risks, and we won't need as much time because we would have done a lot of groundwork with this first one. So I hope we can continue to cover the other two main topics within this morning. But sorry, just a quick more comment before we take a break.
This is Chris. Yeah, so my last question could be saved for the next section. So that works. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I have 11 o'clock. We will reconvene at 11:10.
Awesome.
Okay, it looks like we are back. And I do notice that we are run through quite a lot of our time. Perhaps the Sempra team would like to make some proposals about what topics to touch on. I have my own ideas and suggestions about what we might do in our last hour, but I'll go with you, Joe, first.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it. As you mentioned at the break, I definitely agree. The discussion we are having with regards to the medium pressure, whether it be the quant or whether it be when we get into the integrity management, a lot of that will flow over into the other chapters as well. And so we focus, we spend a little bit more time on medium pressure. Again, maybe finish up with Chris's questions and then start going over the integrity management. Let the team talk about what they do, how what they do then fits into, rolls up into ramp, and then finish up that, and then we can do the high pressure. Again, we may not have time to do the storage, but I think the overall content is very similar, and certainly from the quant standpoint, it'll be similar. It's just a question of, again, indicating what type of data and the sources of that data. So I think those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I feel that proceeding through the other risk chapters and the other examples will be just a continuation of similar approach. I think the approach is probably the same, and the way that the data sources were developed is similar, and that we've now got an appreciation of how the work papers indicate where the data came from. We've also seen that some of these calculations in the work papers are not fully, fully detailed out in what's been provided to parties and ourselves yet, and I expect that would be the same for these others. So I think, yeah, if we can charge ahead on the agenda, just recognizing we probably won't get through all the topics by the end of the workshop. So I agree. Let's go ahead with, if Chris had questions right away, we can start with that.
Yeah, so my last quick question on this had to do, and actually it might be for the integrity management folks later, but on this one, the plastic pipe shows percent effectiveness being 305%. And my takeaway was, well, there's no leaks after you replace it. I was curious, is this being based upon metrics that SoCalGas is using for its own situation in terms of leaks with the out of the lay or the plastic pipe? Is that based upon metrics that SoCalGas is tracking to then use to then develop, well, there's no leaks after we replace it?
Yeah, this is Jeff. Hopefully, I had to kind of log back in so everybody can hear me, hopefully. Yeah, so in essence, to essentially get that sort of factor, we look, as I said, we looked at non-state-of-the-art and state-of-the-art pipe. We used leak data internally that we have for that to characterize sort of like a leak per mile, if you will, and then calculated an average sort of typical profile, if you will, for a non-state-of-the-art pipe versus a state-of-the-art pipe, and sort of backed out kind of that factor. So specific to your question, it's not necessary. When you say metrics, I don't want to confuse that with some of the SMAP sort of proceedings going on, and those metrics, it's internal data that we have from the integrity folks.
Got it. Thank you. Internal leak data. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'll just, to everybody's point, we're still on medium pressure. You're absolutely right that the workbooks function the same between the risks. So I don't mind kind of, camping out on the medium pressure side if we want to continue. Here, other than that, if there is no more questions specific to the workbooks, at least for medium pressure, we can turn it over to our in-house folks to talk a little bit about integrity and kind of what we do there. But I'll pause there for anything else after Chris. Okay.
All right, so then if no questions, appreciate it. And then Mark, not sure if it's going to be you or Travis takes the lead.
Yeah, Joe, I'll kick it off and then I'll hand off to Mark and he can get deeper into the details. So, hi everybody, my name is Travis Sarah. I'm the Director of Integrity Management and I have Mark Forster on the line with me. He's the manager within Integrity Management responsible for our DIMP program. And he's going to give you a high overview of the DIMP program, explain to you the context of DIMP so that when we talk about risk modeling or dreams or any of the other topic areas that we want to get into, you've got the broad context for it. So I guess keep in mind here that we're sort of focusing in now on a compliance program, right? DIMP is a code-driven compliance program. There's a specific structure to it and specific requirements. And so a lot of the discussion that we're going to have is sort of within that framework. Rather than take a bunch more time, I know Mark's got detail to get to, so I think I will just hand off directly to him. He's going to walk you through some of the major elements of the program, give you the basic skeletal structure, and then explain to you how DIMP feeds into that backbone. So Mark, why don't you go ahead and come off of mute and give these folks a high fly overview of DIMP.
Okay, we'll do that. So as Travis said, DIMP is a code-based program, code required, 49 CFR Part 192, and specifically Subpart P. So in DIMP, we're required to know our system, we're required to identify the threats on our system, and we're required to evaluate the risk based off those results. And then based off those results, we do investigations of those threats, and those results lead into programs that we identify as part of DIMP that address particular threats on the system. And generally those threats are kind of subsets of assets, so we don't generally, address a complete asset class like pipelines, right? So we address portions of the system. And in particular, we're talking a lot about dreams, and dreams is made up of the BSRP and the VIPP, the bare steel replacement plan, and the vintage integrity plastic plan. And those are targeting specific subsets of our pipeline system, and we call those non-state-of-the-art portions of the system. And so we have our risk analytics that we use on those assets, those subsets of those assets. And we do evaluate those assets at a segment level. And we look at such attributions as, well, we look at asset attributions on those segments, like, the age, the date we installed it, the material, obviously, the vintage integrity plastic plan is plastic, right? That vintage integrity plastic plan also looks at manufacture, as somebody mentioned outlay a little earlier. And then we include other data, like operational data, like our leak repairs. We associate those leak repairs to those assets. And as we pull all that data in, we do our risk analytics to determine what segments we're prioritizing for replacement, and that feeds into how we do the work. So we have these segment evaluations, but to optimize the work for our planning teams, we provide them a 5-year plan. So we look at the results of our analytics. We provide that optimized 5-year plan for areas of the system that we show as higher risk, and then that planning team will then execute on that plan. And we do check annually, because we're getting operational data throughout the year, and that gets associated and related to those segments. We do run analytics on an annual basis and then make updates to that plan as needed. but we try to give them a fairly static, if we can. Doesn't always work like that, static plan to work off of, because that helps them optimize their work. And so as we've presented our strategy in prior GRCs, is, we're continually increasing, our strategy to continually increase the rate of our replacement for these pipeline assets. And I think Tom mentioned, with 25,000 miles of the vintage plastic. So we're increasing at rates that are reasonable and feasible for us to do, and we're continuing to increase at those rates through the next, through our next GRC, to address those particular assets in our system. So I don't know, Travis, you have anything more I might have missed?
No, that was a good overview, Mark. Maybe just spend a minute or two describing the way that DIMP fits up into this DIMP framework. Just describe for the audience how we utilize dreams to help us prioritize the work, since that was a specific topic area addressed earlier.
Well, we use the we use the results from our risk analytics to drive that replacement plan that we communicate to our planning and construction team. Sorry.
No, that's good. I think, okay, maybe I'll jump in. I think the point here being that you're seeing the end of the program. That's really sort of the boots on the ground. The program is driving specific actions. And so when we're talking about the DIMP program, you're within a context that's actually driving some physical work. And so this is very much focused at the operational level. This is the level of analytics that really dictates the action we want to take in the field. So Mark was driving there. He was saying the risk analytics inform our decision making. That decision making then in turn prompts a physical action, in this case a replacement. And so when we do talk about these analytics, we're really talking about a program, a code, compliance-driven program that's really speaking to taking a physical action. I think that's probably the level I wanted to go to, Mark. So thanks. Maybe we'll stop here for a second, since I think we've kind of provided a broad brush overview, and let's just see where the conversation takes us.
So this is Tom Long from Turn. I have a few questions. Thank you for that presentation. First question is, when you say this is a code-based program, I agree with that, but the code does not dictate how many miles of, say, plastic pipe need to be replaced. That's based on your assessment and your evaluation of what needs to be done. Is that fair?
Code doesn't specify prescriptively how many miles.
Okay. You've been doing this program for many years. Let's focus on the vintage plastic pipe program, replacement program. So you have 25,000 miles in the system. You've already replaced a fair amount of non-state-of-the-art pipe. That's the term you used. Can you tell me how much of the non-state-of-the-art pipe has been replaced already?
I'd have to go back and look to see. I don't know offhand, I'm sorry.
Is it 5,000, 10,000?
No.
Ballpark?
Well, it's less than 1,000.
Less than 1,000 has been replaced so far. The amount, the pipe that was replaced, I presume that was the pipe that was flagged in your risk analysis as the highest priority, the highest risk pipe. Is that right?
Yeah, it was identified in the the higher risk portion of our analytics.
Okay. Do you expect to and so as you extend this program further into the system, you're going to be reaching pipe that's of less risk. The further along you go, you'll be reaching lesser risk pipe. Isn't that right?
Yeah, because we're targeting the higher risk pipelines. We should be seeing pipelines of lesser risk. as we move along in the program.
So this ramp is to help us, help those of us who are previewing your GRC understand SoCalGas's assessment of how much, for this program, how much pipe needs to be replaced and what the risk assessment is on that pipe. And so it looks, and I quoted this earlier, there's a range of pipe that you're planning to replace, but over a 3-year period, it's in the neighborhood of 300 miles or about 100 miles a year. Is that a rough approximation?
You're just talking about one of the programs for the VIP? Yeah.
The plastic pipe, yeah.
Plastic, yeah.
And so that's the question that we're interested in, because that program is close to $700 million for 3 years, and then they put the steel replacement program yet. You're getting close to $1 billion, which is a lot of money. And so the question we want the commission to think about and have information about is whether the 100 miles a year, which is a very costly program, is the right scope of the program, whether it should be less or whether it should be more, and have information about how to know what the risk trade-offs are when you change the scope of the program. So if let's say the program were cut in half, I don't see anything that helps me in this RSE, in the RSE analysis that's in the report, that would help me understand how much risk reduction of the risk reduction that would be achieved by the 100-mile program, how much of that risk reduction would be achieved if we did a 50-mile program. I assume it would be more than 50%. It could be 80, 90% or something, because they're diminishing risk reduction returns as you extend the program deeper into the system. Am I right about? Do you understand what I'm getting at? And is it right that this is not in the ramp report an explanation of how you settled on 100 miles and what the trade-offs are if you were to do a program of lesser scope?
Well, I don't know if
Tom, well, this is Elliot. Tom, are you just asking the general question of, it sounds like you've got a general question or a point you're trying to make. I don't know if you want to just clarify that. It was kind of cross-examination, and now it sounds like you're trying to, make a point. I don't know if you want to just say what it is you're trying to say instead of making it a question.
Well, let me ask this question. If the program were cut in half, would the risk reduction be greater than 50% of the full program?
I don't know if I'll let Mark answer, but that sounds like a tough hypothetical to ask here on the phone.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that as far as specifically is it going to be half. I couldn't say exact.
Okay.
Well, so I think I will say one thing, Mr. Long. I think you're getting to there's a certain notion here getting to, right, which is if we've got a risk ranking top to bottom and you're working this list down and the risk is prioritized, the remainder is presumably less risky than the bottom of the list is presumably less risky than the top, and there's some sort of sense of diminishing returns, right? I think in theory, hypothetically, that's kind of easy to follow. I think the reality, though, is the endeavor is a lot more dynamic than it kind of might seem conceptually. In other words, we're learning as we go. You do some work, you gather some data, and you iterate. You do more work, you gather data, and you iterate. So in a perfect world, sure, we could make a forecast, and then we could, make adjustments. And if this forecast was static, then I think the world starts to look more like what you're driving towards. But I think the reality here is, or just a point to sort of help with, is realize that there's a dynamism at play here, and a lot of the lessons learned feed back into the program, and then another adjustment is made. So it can be complex, and I think it's important for everyone to know that there's a refreshing that's occurring at least annually, right? And this refresh revisits all of our basic assumptions, and then it repaints the risk picture, and then you take a step forward again, and you repeat and you repeat again, at least annually. And so it's not quite as straightforward as it might seem on the surface.
Right, and here SoCalGas has come up with a forecast that it may or may not stick to in its GRC of about 100 miles of years of replacement, and we want to know what the basis of that forecast is and what was the view of the risk reduction and why it was 100 miles, why it wasn't 75 miles, why it wasn't 50 miles. But my point is, and I will just make this as a point, my point is when we don't have RSC values that reflect the internal analysis that SoCalGas is using to decide on the scope of the program and how much risk is going to be reduced, you have an operational program, this dreams tool that you use. Why can't that be reflected in the RSC analysis? Why can't we have RSCs that group your system based on the priorities of risk that you're using to make decisions about what to address in the rate case period?
Well, that was a question. I mean, I think we understand the comment and Turn's position, or Turn's argument that it should be used.
Well, it actually, and you're right, Elliot. It was a question, then a comment, and then it turned into a question. Why can't that Dreams tool be used to help us group this pipe in more granular tranches so that we can have RSCs that provide the information for the commission to see how the RSC drops off as we extend this program deeper into the system?
Well, I believe it is used, but I don't know that it's used in a way that lends itself to but it's more than others.
Sorry, Elliot, you're garbling a little bit.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Thanks. That was weird. What I said was I don't think that that's accurate to say that it's not used in creating RSCs. I don't know that it's used or that it lends itself to the creation of tranches, but perhaps maybe others can explain or more color to what I'm saying.
Well,
I could take a stab at this one too. I think the Dreams model was purpose-built to help us manage the DIMP program, right? This DIMP program is, again, like we stated, it's a code-based, compliance-driven program, and so in order to execute this program, we created a purpose-driven model to help us make those physical decisions I was sort of describing, an actual action. I think on some level, the task of managing risk at the enterprise level, though complementary, is separate than the specific compliance-driven work that we're talking about within DIMP. So you have the dynamic of one part of the company attempting to manage risk across the enterprise. You have a separate part of the company, the integrity management program specifically that we're talking about today, trying to do it within this compliance program. They inform each other, they interact, but they are not the same. And so, we talk about, I think, I'm sorry, your name's escaping, Mr. Long, sorry, you kind of got to the notion of granularity. And I would say, sure, the closer you get to the pipe, the closer you start to drive to this need for granularity. But I would also say that in many ways, perhaps the opposite movement is true as we get to the enterprise level. Granularity itself has diminishing returns. When I start looking at from a 20, 30, 40,000 foot view, I'm not doing it with a microscope. I'm very much doing it with a broad lens. And so there is a distinction here. I guess what I'm trying to really drive at is we talk about dreams, but it's very much to do work on the pipe. It's not necessarily to help us manage the system at this 20 to 30,000 foot level. So hopefully that helps.
I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate the discussion. Are there any other questions for the distribution integrity management team? If not, the next discussion transitions over into the high pressure.
Sorry, could I just ask a quick question? Can you hear me?
Sure.
Does the dreams model that you were talking about, does that calculate a risk score for each segment of pipe, or does it just rank them based on certain characteristics?
Yeah, it's a relative risk model, so it ranks them relative to the other pipelines that are being assessed.
Okay, but not based on a risk score.
There is a risk result that allows us to do the ranking. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Anyone else before we transition over to high pressure? Brett?
Well, before we jump ahead, our intention was to reserve the final 15 minutes for a wrap up and discussion of next steps. So I want to be cautious and just a reminder. I think probably the parties will want to talk about some follow-up steps and be sure we can have chance to address that. So just bear that in mind. We have fairly limited time to go into the next topic.
Yeah, Fred, thanks for that time check. You're corrected. I have 10:38. To the extent we, in essence, have Jeff go over the quant analysis for the high pressure risk. As we mentioned, the supplemental work papers, same format. I think the data sources, the same idea. If the team would like to do that, we can. Again, not recognizing we have just 5 minutes to do that, or we could start our wrap up now, and then that probably when it comes 12 o'clock, to the extent we can be more assured that we will in fact be able to wrap up cleanly at 12 o'clock.
Maybe we could launch into the specific example of the RSE calculation in high pressure. Would that be acceptable to folks as a use of our time right now?
Can you, all right, and then can you give Jeff the ability to take control of the screen? And
That's
then,
our
Brevin,
person.
and then he can load up the high pressure.
Okay. So what you should be seeing on my screen is the high pressure supplemental work paper. As kind of mentioned and what we've been alluding to, it's very similar to the other worksheets. We have a risk scoring work paper and an RFC work paper. The formulas are the same. You still have your percent risk addressed and your percent mitigation scope and percent effectiveness. And you're like all the same elements determined in very similar ways. Again, with the effectiveness, the same idea applies. We're targeting more risky pipe then we would just blanket all over, it's the system pipe, and the formulas are seen here. So I'm actually just going to kind of pause there and be like, if there's anything that folks want me to walk through, I can, or if we just kind of want to start into the discussion about it, we certainly can do that. But I'll pause right there.
I have some questions right off the bat.
Sure.
I think the the programs we're looking at here in the integrity assessment and remediation, I would assume that there is probably not a lot of actual pipe replacement in those because your lifetime benefit numbers are fairly short. It looks more like the lifetime benefit is synchronized with possibly the cycle of integrity management reviews. Can you tell us a little bit about what the costs are in integrity assessment and remediation?
Sure, I'm going to give it a go. If I, for the integrity folks, if I mischaracterize it, please jump in. You're right. So we're looking sort of at that, cyclical compliance schedule. We have to assess our pipes every so often. And so that's why you're seeing this sort of lifetime benefit and any sort of smaller remediations thereof. But yeah, just to be short on it and the time, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, this is Tom Long from Turn. Could you
Yes, sir.
go to the risk scoring work paper?
Sure. I need to zoom in maybe.
Can you explain the difference between transmission and supply lines?
Sure. So again, when we looked at risk on the system and for high pressure, we wanted to try and accurately capture the differences between transmission and supply lines. So in our system, we have lines that are operated by distribution that are also high pressure, and we call those supply lines. And so we make the distinction in the sub-event and characterize that slightly differently than transmission events. Sometimes it's the same because obviously the operating pressures can be higher, but that's essentially what you're seeing here is a high consequence, low consequence transmission, high consequence supply, low consequence supply, which is synonymous with safety impact, rupture or explosion, and non-safety impact.
So supply lines are still operating at sufficiently high pressure to be considered high pressure. That's greater than 60 psig?
Yes, anything over 60 pounds per square inch gauge is what you see in this chapter.
Okay, but supply lines are different from transmission pipe in what? How are they different?
They're not, well, two characterizations. Not all supply lines are DOT defined. They operate less than 20% SMICE, but they're still considered high pressure. And our distribution folks operate those.
So is the distinction in the percent SMICE that
Well, there's two distinctions. It's the percent SMICE, and it's also in operationally who's operating the pipeline in our company. So like I said, supply lines are a distribution asset, and transmission obviously are transmission assets. But you can have a supply line that's 61 pounds and less than 21% SMICE, or 20% SMICE, I'm sorry.
Okay. And that's for purposes of calculating pre-mitigation risk scores. That's what this risk scoring work paper is about. That's as much as you broke down the system. You're not breaking it down further into compressor stations or measurement and regulation stations and other components of the high pressure system. Is that right?
So we are. So our tranche essentially at this level is consistent with how we do our operation. So to your question, yeah, a transmission system will have a compressor or an odorizer asset, and that we try to capture as granularly as possible those different assets within this system. So to your point, does it include compressors? Yes, it does.
Right. It includes, I mean, the whole system is included, I guess, right? I mean,
yes,
the whole, but you broke out supply lines and transmission. But I'm just wondering why you didn't break out compressors and measurement and regulator stations and other facilities that I think get addressed differently from pipe.
So this is a good kind of what I described earlier. It's like how we, and Travis made the point too, the differences of how we view how we're mitigating risk and how we're quantifying risk. At the enterprise level, we have this very, very broad view. And so to your point about tranches, we tranche and we go, okay, high pressure, it's everything. How can we get more granular? Okay, transmission system or supply line system. Within those systems, we have all the assets covered under there. And where we have data, we've tried to build in sort of a latent, score around that. It's not to say that it's not covered, because of course it's covered, because back to our RSC discussion, when we go to look at risk address, we're looking at the total incidences and, to your point about regulator stations. Well, if we're doing a regulator station, replacement or, any sort of M&R activity, we're going to focus in on those particular incidences that may have been caused by M&R stations or the like. So it is captured in here. I don't want it to seem like we're not capturing that, because we are. It's just a more high level view, a system approach view.
But if the commission were interested in knowing what parts of the high pressure system pose the highest risks, we don't really know that. We don't know what the risk is for a given compressor station or from the measurement and regulator stations. We don't know it broken down by component of the high pressure system, by categories of components of the high pressure system.
So let me make sure I understand what you're asking. Do we prioritize different assets against each other and assign a risk score based on that? No, but what we do, and kind of what we talked about in integrity, is if a certain asset has some sort of, if we look at all our assets on the system, and if we do have programs internally to say, well, do we need to be looking at a specific subset of asset? And the VIP and the BSRP are perfect examples of that. Like, we go, hey, we definitely identified a portion of the system or an asset that we need to look at. And we do the same thing on the regular station side. Maybe there's more regular stations out there that are riskier than others based on, vintage and stuff like that. So we do that. I don't want to bring the impression that we're not.
Okay, well, I'll stop there. Maybe in the interest of time, that's a good place to stop.
Sure.
This is Jonathan Lesser. I had one quick question, and it goes to, in the same worksheet, the SoCal gas territory and high consequence area adjustment, which is the same value as in the medium pipe. But what I'd like to know is, are you assuming, or does the PIMSA data show that all high consequence transmission events occur in high consequence areas? Is that your assumption?
No. So let me see, in the interest of time, do it real quick. When we look at the risk as a whole, we want to capture a homogeneous risk profile for the entire system. To Tom's point, we have a lot of different things in that system, so how you do it can vary and look differently. So when we looked at the risk profile, we wanted to capture, how that our system does operate in some high consequence, but also, not all our pipe is in high consequence. So what you're seeing in the risk score level is we're essentially trying to sort of get an overarching picture of the risk profile that encompasses both HCA and non-HCA. But to your second part of the question, are we only looking at incidences that happen in high consequence areas? No, we're not. We do look at different rates to develop factors that you're probably referring to in HCA and out of HCA at the national level and at the SoCal gas level, but we're not just specifically focused in, and maybe that's kind of the nuance between the high consequence and low consequences. And that definition, that high consequence, doesn't mean we're only focused on the high consequence areas. It just means a hazardous incident with a rupture or a safety impact.
That wasn't my question, actually. It was more your adjustment, which appears to assume that all incidents occur. I mean, you say a high consequence area adjustment. And so my question was simply trying to determine whether all those high consequence events occur in high consequence areas. Simple as that.
No. The answer is no. We looked at everything.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think
This is Melinda Dickinson from Protect Our Communities. Can you go through the page that that we were working through on the last one that had the examples of when utility-specific data was used? And also, can you give an explanation on the percentage effectiveness using this example? Two separate questions. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, like the other work, I'll try to be quick. I want to, again, I have a hard stop at 12. The data here, it's the same for this workbook and all the workbooks. Is you kind of say what you can go, what's the basis? Oh, it's SPENSA. Oh, okay, let's look at the metric. And we're looking at hazardous incidents, which are just defined nationally. So you can kind of walk through and say, okay, so in total nationally, we have 96 hazardous incidents. In SoCalGas at PHMSA, we have 2. So that kind of generates your likelihood there. As far as the effectiveness, what I should say is that the same sort of technique applies here in the high pressure as it did the medium pressure. We tried to make an adjustment in the effectiveness to incorporate if we were in HCA or non-HCA, and I think that's part of the tranche discussion, but we did that to make the distinction if you're doing a risk mitigation in a high consequence area versus a non-HCA area. So I hope that answers the question.
I guess I'm trying to understand how in like in a scenario where you're talking about having what did you guys call it, code-driven compliance program, where you are specifically looking, you're doing ILIs and you're finding where there's problems in a particular pipeline, and then you're correcting those particular problems. How could you get into the way over 100% world?
So with this one,
because it's so targeted and precise, what the integrity assessments require.
Yeah, again, it follows that same sort of logic because it is so targeted, as you mentioned, and you're only sort of globbing onto these riskier type pipes. The effectiveness of doing this mitigation is going to
No, it doesn't mean it's a riskier type pipe. It just means that you have been doing the required maintenance so as to prevent it from becoming a riskier pipe.
Yeah.
It prevents problems like that.
Yeah, let me rephrase that. You're right. Because we're looking at pipes with these tools and we're doing a greater assessment of it, we can say this mitigation has a greater effectiveness because, like you say, we're getting more data on the pipeline instead of just saying, well, it was installed in 1967, so we think it fits this risk profile. So it's because we're continually going out there and reassessing and looking at these pipes and gathering data. Any sort of mitigation we do is going to have this greater, in our opinion, this greater effectiveness because you're out there doing this pipe essentially, or doing this mitigation work with this greater understanding of what the pipe is actually doing.
I guess greater than what is, maybe that's where I'm having a problem understanding.
If you didn't ILI it, or if you didn't do your smart inspections, or if you didn't do this program. So I think in the interest of time, I think it would be wise to switch gears and kind of next steps.
Yeah, we need to talk about next steps, and we have a very limited time. I think the approach maybe we can follow is to, again, request parties to email to the service list what remaining topics and questions they have, and to start thinking about making data requests on specific additional questions you may have that we just can't seem to get to everybody's question in these kinds of workshop events. But I basically think our mode for handling follow-up would be through additional feedback from parties emailed in to the service list, and we'll see how we can proceed from there. I apologize that we only dealt with a portion of the anticipated topics, but I'm very, very pleased by the level of detail that we did get to. And I want to thank all the party questions and the Sempra presenters. And I feel it's very effective for me workshop today. We got 3 more minutes, so please fire away on any further follow-up questions or comments.
This is Tom Long, getting into brass tacks. I'm fine with the follow-up approach you described, Fred, and suggest that maybe we send our emails after we've completed the workshop on Friday. We can take both workshops into account in suggesting next steps.
All right.
So maybe Tuesday next week.
Yeah, as far as, yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. I did also want to offer that the work papers that were planned to be reviewed at the workshop today, I think those are all work papers that have been previously provided, but if it would help people for those to be remailed out to the service list following the workshop today, I'd be happy to do that. Do people feel like they've already seen these work papers? They already have access?
Fred, I'm sorry for interrupting. For clarity, they've been sent out to the parties, and the parties is not necessarily the entire service list.
Oh, well, okay, then we will limit, it's Sempra's in charge of distributing their data, so I will leave it at that.
And we've asked for these to be put up on the website to make it easier for people to access. Still would hope that can happen.
I thought that was a great idea, Tom. I hope that happens, Melinda.
And that way we don't have to rummage through everyone's data request responses to see if additional work papers have been provided to certain parties.
Could we depend on Sempra to follow through with that item?
Fred, I've been coordinating with Tom, letting him know that we are actively pursuing viable options.
Very good.
Well, that just means that I've been told that they're looking into it. They've been looking into it for a while. I just don't understand why we just can't get an answer, like why it can't be posted.
Joe, let's take that as an action item that you can provide a response on, please.
I am, as I said, we are pursuing options to be able to post them, and those that pursue includes why we may not be able to post them, or as I said, we are actively following up on Tom's request.
Very good. All right. Okay. Tom, go ahead.
The other follow-up item, and I guess we can put it in our comments, but I don't want it to get lost, is that out of the discussion today, we clarified that we do not have at this point in the work papers input values for the RSE summary work paper, and in particular for columns H, I, J, and K. And it would be very, very helpful to have those input values. When you click on those cells, you just get a number. You don't get the inputs that those numbers were derived from. And the reason we're focusing on this is because this is the guts of what determines the effectiveness of the mitigation. That's how you determine whether the percent, it's ultimately the percent that the lure is going to change. And since lure is driving the effectiveness of these mitigations, it's very important to get behind these numbers. So it would be good to have something equivalent to the risk scoring work paper. SoCalGas has shown they can do it. That the bottom half of the risk scoring work paper is pretty close to what we need. We just don't have it for the RSE summary, for those columns I just mentioned for the RSE summary, those sources, the inputs and the sources of the inputs. That would be that's in our view, that should have been provided when in the initial work papers, according to row 29 of the settlement. It's long overdue, but we'd ask that it be remedied as soon as possible.
This is Elliot. I'm sure you're wrapping up. I know a bunch of us on the SoCal gas team. We have to stop. We have to stop now. So, thank you.
Thank you all very much, and I look forward to our next workshop on Friday.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.